Hi, this is an unexpected launch, a show about stories and the people behind them. I'm speaking with people who've gracefully navigated an unexpected life circumstance. These are stories of resilience, connection, and community, stories of lives being reimagined, rewritten, and rebuilt. I'm Kirsten, and today's story is about Shari. Shari's a fighter. After being abandoned at birth, Shari methodically completed one checklist after another, becoming a lawyer, a wife, a mother, a breast cancer survivor, a life coach, and most recently, an author. Her first book, The 50-50 Friendship Flow, was recently published, and it's gone far beyond a book. Shari's created a movement. When Shari entered into her 40s, she realized that something was missing from her life. After surviving a catastrophic car accident and a breast cancer diagnosis requiring a double mastectomy, Shari reevaluated her life and her friendships. She vowed that she wouldn't let another year pass without sharing what her friends mean to her. These conversations were life changing and resulted in her debut book. Welcome to an unexpected launch, Shari.
Hi, thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm excited to be talking with you today. So, Shari, I'm going to start at the very beginning of your life, which was traumatic. You were born in Korea, you were abandoned, you were left in a cardboard box in a parking lot, and eventually you were adopted. Can you tell
Mhm.
us your experience as an adopted child and how that experience shaped you?
Sure. Well, this is back in 1970 when I was adopted. I was born sometime in 1969. I say sometime because I actually, as you mentioned, I was abandoned and found in a cardboard box. It was a parking lot in Seoul, Korea. I was found without any identifying information. So I do know I was born in 1969. I just don't know exactly when. But my adoption story started in 1970 when I was adopted by an American couple and came over here to the United States. And this was a time when international adoptions it was still in its infancy. South Korea was the first country to internationally adopt as a result of the Korean War. Although I'm not a direct product of the Korean War, I'm still considered that first wave of adoptees. So our adoption experience is a lot different than adoptees nowadays. We didn't have the internet. Our parents didn't have groups necessarily to talk to discuss adoption issues. So growing up as an adopted child from South Korea in 1970 and my early years, uh, adoption really wasn't talked about. And it wasn't hidden from me, but it was really brushed under the rug. I really didn't start processing what it meant to me until much later in life.
So, you in turn adopt a daughter who coincidentally was also abandoned in a cardboard box. How did being adopted shape your views of motherhood, specifically guiding your daughter and really truly understanding what challenges and questions might lie ahead for her?
Yeah, I learned a lot about my own adoption after adopting her. And by the time we adopted her, which was 2001, we did have these adoption groups, and I was able to see other adopted children and watching her grow up and seeing the questions that she's had. She's now in her first year of college. I found, wow, these are very similar experiences that she and I are having. She was adopted from China, a different country, but very similar experiences. She doesn't know her birth date either. The struggle with identity and really trying to find a place. There's a lot of similarities, and I think the fact that we have similar experiences that gives us a place to find a common story. And I feel that really helps with her um, acceptance of kind of who she is and the things that she doesn't know about herself.
Well, and I can imagine as you're seeing her go through your journey, you may have started processing things that you hadn't really thought of before. And that's one of the reasons I'm so happy that you're sharing your story with me today. Because again, I truly believe that by sharing our journey and sharing our story, not only do we help other people through their journey, but we continue to learn about ourselves, which is so important.
Yes, I mean, it's little things like I would watch adults tell my daughter how lucky she was to have a family. And they're very well meaning adults, but it reminded me, wow, what was that like growing up as a child, always being told that you're lucky to have a family and the effects that that has? Or even though she looks similar to me, she's constantly explaining why she belongs in the family she does. Her brother is a biological product of my husband and I, and they don't look similar. And so she's always had to explain, even to adult strangers as a child, why she belongs in her family. And seeing her do that, I remember doing that myself and just recognizing that as a young child growing up that way, always trying to justify or having to justify that you belong in a family, it has to have some level of effect.
Well, and in fact, in your blog, you talk about some of these things, and you address that adoption, whether you are adopted or you are adopting a child, that it can be a really traumatic event, and that children who are adopted, as you've just mentioned, face an identity crisis. What advice would you have for children who are adopted and for parents who are adopting a child?
I think one thing that is either ignored or glossed over that really needs to be addressed at some point is the loss that the adoptee has. You know, the loss of the birth family, sometimes the birth country, uh, that entire identity. We spend so much time celebrating adoption, which I think is wonderful. I think adoption is fabulous, but we can't ignore the loss either, and we have to make sure that our adopted children feel comfortable talking about their loss.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Creating that safe space,
Mhm.
and as you say, being made to feel that you were lucky to be in a family. These are things, I think that people are so well meaning, but often don't
Mhm.
understand the impact of something that's seemingly simple, how that impacts a child and their identity.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think about that and I think, wow, to constantly be told that you're lucky to have a home is it's actually it's quite shocking when you think about it.
I agree. So I want to go back a little. We mentioned this a little bit at the beginning, that just even as a young girl, you've always been a checklist person, completing your life in order, and you progressed through your life in a stepwise fashion that really made sense to you at the time. And I so relate to this, and I suspect that many other women particularly will, somewhat blindly walking through life and not really taking time to be mindful of the choices that we're making. And we follow an order that is it prescribed by society, or I'm not quite sure, but we don't really ask ourselves what we truly want. And so I'm curious, do you still approach your life in this I should do X, Y, or Z fashion?
I am, in a sense, still a checklist person, but it's a different type of checklist. My checklist now, because I love lists, I'm a schedule-oriented person, but it's what I want to do. It's what I feel I want to do next. And I think that I parent differently because of this. And my daughter, who is more of a creative mind than the rest of us at home, we're very linear in our thought, and she has this amazing creative mind. And I always tell her, to explore and do what you love. Don't worry about doing, if you want to go to a 4-year college, great, that's perfect. But if you have a different path, that's fine too. And I think just understanding this, that you now at this age, that checklist is something that needs to come from inside and not this external, um, these external expectations that we think other people have on us is really important especially as we parent our children.
I agree with you, and I was exactly that checklist stepwise person. I did everything in the order that I thought that I should be doing, and my middle son, for example, didn't go to college, and I think that before that would have just really thrown me for a loop. But now I like you, I so embrace encouraging people to think about, what do you truly want, because we have time and choices and opportunity to explore these things. There is absolutely no reason that we should go through life in this stepwise fashion just because other people have. And so I think it's really empowering and really freeing. And I like you, feel that I parent in a different way with that perspective that I didn't have when my children were younger, and I wish that I would have.
Yeah, me too. I learned it a little later in life, but later is better than nothing, right?
Exactly. Exactly. So, Sherry, I want to shift gears a little bit. And in 2017, you were diagnosed with breast cancer. And I want to take you back to that first moment when you heard the diagnosis, you have breast cancer. What were your first thoughts in that moment?
So, it was interesting because being that checklist person, I was somebody that schedule-oriented person that went to my mammogram appointments every single year from age 40 on. And I had earlier that year as well. And I had just happened to be in my doctor's office for something entirely unrelated. And she mentioned that I had not had a physical that year. And we kind of hemmed and hawed whether or not I wanted to do it that day. We went ahead, and that's when she felt a lump, and then the diagnostic process started. So this really, as it does with a lot of, if not most, cancer patients, came out of the blue. My son was 15 and my daughter was 17 at the time. And I do remember the day when I got the call from my doctor telling me that I had breast cancer. She apologized and said, "I'm sorry, you have breast cancer." And I literally fell to my knees. I remember that moment. I was paralyzed.
Mhm. And hearing that diagnosis and feeling that paralysis, what did you fear the most of hearing that diagnosis?
My, I don't. Well, I know what my fear is now, and actually, as you asked that question, I am thinking about the fear. Of course, is death, dying. I don't know that I was as afraid of the medical treatments, I thought at the time, but definitely leaving my kids, that was the biggest.
Mhm. And I remember reading, I believe in your blog, that you told your children about your diagnosis. What was that like to watch their faces as you're sharing that diagnosis?
Yeah, we called for a family meeting, and, at the time, we had 1 dog, we didn't have 2, but my son, who was 15, was sitting on the floor with my dog, our dog, and he wouldn't look at my husband or I, as I explained that I had breast cancer. He just said he knew. He because I was the parent that always went and picked him up from school, took him to school, and in recent weeks, because the I had not known this until my experience, the diagnostic procedure could be lengthy, with a number of appointments, and he recognized that I wasn't able to pick him up from school, so he knew something was up. He stayed pretty quiet. My daughter looked over at my husband and said, "Dad's crying." And once she made that notice, of course, everyone started crying. But yeah, that's one of those moments that sticks in my head, and it kind of plays back like a slow motion movie for me.
Well, I think our children are so intuitive,
Mhm.
and I think that we may think that we're sheltering them from something, or that maybe we're going about our day as that everything is just fine. But I'm so fascinated by how intuitive our children are, and often they may be thinking something or feeling it, but they don't ask us. So, like, your son never said, "Gosh, mom, you're not picking me up. Is everything okay?"
Mhm.
But they're wondering that in the back of their mind, and they're processing these things.
Yes, and I remember, after that, my husband then was still picking him up quite a bit, driving him quite a bit 'cause I had many appointments, and one afternoon, my husband said, "You need to talk to our son, Zach, because he said, 'Dad, there's no cure for cancer.'" So he had been doing his own research on his own, unbeknownst to us, with the internet and looking things up. So that's one thing I think that I would probably do differently in the situation. I may talk to my kids a little bit more about the process that I was going through.
Well, and at the time we do the best that we can, and it's really only in retrospect that we think, we could have done these things differently. And this again is why I love having these conversations, because I really like for people who might be in your shoes thinking about, how do I tell my children, or how do I help my children through this process? These are things that in the moment you don't have the bandwidth to be thinking about these things. You're simply trying to absorb the diagnosis, go through treatment. And so by hearing stories of others, it helps us think about, what are those little tips that I might not otherwise know. So thank you, Shari. I really appreciate you being so open. Um,
Mhm.
one of the things that you also mentioned is how much you struggled with loneliness during your cancer treatment. And I know that you are not alone in this feeling. So many people who are going through cancer feel isolated and lonely. And I'd love to know, what helped you when you were out feeling those loneliest moments? What helped you get through those moments?
Yeah, cancer, as I imagine many other diagnoses, is a very lonely process. You could have a room full of people around you all the time, and you're still alone. It sits in your head, and it kind of it can encompass all your thoughts. For me, that's when I started journaling. Uh, my first thought, actually, and everyone is different. You never know how you're going to react to a tragedy until it happens to you. I used to say that about cancer, and then now I know how I'd react. But my thought when it happened was, there has to be a purpose to this. And I started journaling, and I still journal every day to this day. And part of my journal practice is I look back on, now I'm at 3 years, I look back on the years prior on that date, and I'm able to see the growth and the progress that I've made. So one, journaling really helped me. It kept me on focus too. Also, two, I started listening to podcasts like yours. I searched for podcasts that were inspiring, stories of people who have had struggled or had gone. It wasn't necessarily podcasts about cancer, but people, and hearing their stories about their lives, and recognizing that we all have challenges. um, Oprah's Super Soul Sunday was a big one for me in that regard. So that was the second thing I did. uh, the third thing also was reading. I really picked books because I needed everything that came into my mind to be positive. Uh, I needed to kind of find tools to keep how I wanted to keep my mind on track.
Mhm. Well, I so relate to your listening to podcasts of people, and it didn't matter what their story was. And, when I was in my lowest moments and trying to figure out how to move forward, it was listening to the stories of other people. And it didn't matter what they had been through. It's just that they found themselves on their knees at their lowest moment. And they used that, as you said, what's the purpose of what's happening, and how do I use that to propel myself forward? And so I think that that's again the power of stories. So I'd love to know, what was the most valuable lesson of your cancer journey?
There's a quote that it comes in the form of a question that's I write sometimes in my journal, and it is, if you were if today was the last day of your life, would you be doing what you're doing now? And for me, not just that quote, but having that experience where one day everything was fine and I felt fine. And I actually still felt fine after I got the initial diagnosis. I mean, nothing off, I didn't all of a sudden feel cancer. Um, but having that experience from one day to the next made me realize or emphasize that things can change very fast. And so I want to make sure that the time that I spend each day is doing what I want to do. And this especially comes up for me when I'm not feeling so great, or I'm kind of grumpy, or somebody or something is irritating me. I think about that, and the answer is always no. If I'm in that negative space, that's not how I want to spend my last day. So that's was the big lesson for me personally with the cancer experience.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
So I'm going to switch gears again a little bit, and In your late 40s, you start having conversations with important women in your life. Why was having these conversations important to you, and how did you start having these conversations?
Sure. I happened to attend a memorial service of a friend, and at the memorial service, they gave people the opportunity to stand up and say a few words. And this person, she was obviously loved by so many people. And I recognized some of the people that stood up, others I didn't know, but they were all sharing stories and making comments about how this woman affected their lives. And the stories weren't similar. They were different from each person. I mean, they had a few common threads, but they were amazing stories. And I thought, well, this is great, but how sad is it that they weren't telling her this? So I decided it happened to be right before my 49th birthday. So I decided actually between my 49th and 50th birthday that I was going to sit down and meet one on one with 50 women for the sole purpose of telling them what I've learned from them, what they mean to me, what I see in them, with the idea that everyone we meet is both our teacher and our student.
I think that's so powerful. And I think that, we, particularly as women, we love the women in our lives and we rarely articulate that. And certainly not on the scheme that, or the grand scheme that you did. For 1 year for my birthday, this was after my life had quite transformed, and I was so appreciative of the women in my life. And for my birthday, I said, I don't want any gifts. I want you each to come to the birthday dinner having written something that you admire about each person that is around the table. And it was so powerful. And I think it's not only powerful to share how you feel about people in your life, but as that recipient of that admiration or um, comments of what some a friendship means to you is so powerful, because we often don't hear it and we don't think about it. And so I think it's so important, and this is what I absolutely love about the conversations that you had. And so as you're having these conversations, what did you learn throughout this process?
One, it got easier the further I went along because it's a little bit of an awkward conversation just because we don't do this, as you said, and we talk to our friends, but we never talk about our friendship. And so it did help for me to frame it by telling people I'm taking this challenge or I'm challenging myself, because I at least put it into the framework to make, because everyone wants to help you complete a challenge. But, and doing this though, I captured these meetings on Facebook, and this is before I knew I was going to write about it in a book. I just would capture these and write a little something about it, and I really found that that piece of reflection, that writing part, gave me so much gratitude. And as I went along, and 50 is a big number. So as I went along, it was impossible for me not to just feel so much gratitude for all of the women that have come into my life. Some of them were new acquaintances, others I had known for basically a lifetime. So what I learned from myself is one that I'm lucky, for lack of better words, that I think we all are, and it's just being able to notice this and recognize this uh, was very powerful.
And what do you think that the women that you were having the conversations with, what do you think that they took away from the conversations?
Yeah, it was not uncommon that people got emotional. And as I started to do this, and as I said, I was posting this on Facebook, so the women down the line kind of knew what was coming up. And some would get nervous ahead of time because they had no idea what I was going to say, even though they trusted it was going to be positive. Um, And so I guarantee of every woman that I met with, of those 50 women, will remember that date, and they'll remember it for years. It's something that's going to stick out to them, not because it was some grand dinner or celebration or anything like that, but because it was a moment that somebody said, "Hey, this is what I've learned from you, and this is how you've changed my life." And some of them went ahead and did this challenge themselves. and have paid it forward in different ways, whatever way is comfortable for them. Some are writing notes, others decide to meet with 5 people. One woman decided to meet with some men in her life, mentors, um, but it's an experience that others have taken forward, which I'm thrilled about.
Well, and that's what I alluded to in the beginning, that it's gone beyond a book, and it is a journal as well. It's a fantastic book. I'm absolutely loving reading all of the stories and the takeaways, and I love the reflection. So it's a really powerful book, and I highly recommend it. As you've seen this take off and turn into a movement, how has that impacted you?
I'm so grateful. When I decided to write it or put my experience into this book form, my thought throughout the whole process was, I just want to be able to change one woman. I want one woman to do this, and maybe she'll change another woman. And so every time I get a message from someone, recently I had a woman tell me she sent it to her sister-in-law in Hungary,
Hmm.
and her sister-in-law read the book, and she started doing this in Hungary. And it was the best, the best Facebook message I have ever gotten, actually. Um, so yeah, when I hear that people are doing this in whatever form it takes, one, I'm amazed. Two, I'm really grateful.
Well, I think it's phenomenal, and I highly recommend people try it out. And then speaking of that, you've recently launched another initiative, and now you're meeting with 52 women over Zoom, and you're asking them all the same question, which is, what is the mess that became your message? So tell us about how this concept evolved.
Sure. It was during, well, we're still a little bit in lockdown, but during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're all sitting at home. I have a subscription to Masterclass. And so I was taking Robin Roberts' Masterclass, and she had said that her mom taught her to make her messes her messages. And so I thought, well, hey, this shouldn't be just a one-time thing for me. I can do this again, and this time I can do it through Zoom. And it doesn't have. Last time I met people in person, so people were kind of in my area. Now I'm talking to women all over the country and asking that question: what is your mess that became your message? With mess being anything from something catastrophic to maybe a bad traffic jam or something like that. And the stories have been amazing. It's actually been kind of free therapy for me to hear some of their insights and their journeys.
Well, and I follow you on Facebook and Instagram, so I see your postings about these individuals, and what strikes me every time I read them is that we all have something. We all have a mess. And so many of us are afraid to share our messes. And I personally believe that there is no story that is too messy to be told, because we all learn so much from each other. And there's such a connection in knowing that you're not the only person who's feeling this certain feeling or afraid of something. And so what you're doing is really powerful. And I'd love to know, what is your hope for these conversations?
My hope is that we all learn. It's kind of like it's very similar to what you're doing. I hope we learn from each other from these stories. I just had a woman who I've known for years uh, share with me that she suffers from daily anxiety and depression. I had absolutely no idea, but this is something that my daughter also experiences. And my 1 hour conversation with her became the best conversation I ever had with my daughter. I finally understood what it's like to, as much as I can, to live the way my daughter does, uh, and my daughter realized too that, hey, mom finally kind of gets it. But yeah, these conversations, these messages to messages, they're changing my life. And so my hope is that these messages will also speak to other women.
Well, I have absolutely no doubt that they will, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the final product of these 52 conversations, because I know it's going to be incredibly powerful and insightful.
Thank you.
So we talked a little bit earlier about loneliness and isolation when we were discussing your breast cancer journey. And as you've just mentioned, we are in the midst of a pandemic when many of us are feeling so isolated. What advice do you have for us during this challenging moment?
Well, Zoom helps, but my I would say what I recently told my daughter. She's at school over in Florida, and although the state is more open than where I currently am in Washington State, they still, especially on her campus, are very isolated. And so it's her first year there. She was feeling really isolated and lonely, and I suggested that she challenge herself to, when she does leave her dorm room, to say hello to one new person a day. And then after that, maybe build up and start a conversation with one new person, or say hello to two new people. But I think that during this period of isolation, it takes work. It takes a lot of work. And it could be baby steps, just like that. You go to the grocery store and you decide, okay, I'm going to say hi to somebody today, and pretty soon that gets a little easier, and then you build up on that. But I think, yeah, this is a difficult year, and but we need that human connection. That human connection is so important for happiness. There's so many. I recently graduated from, I think it's called graduation from the Happiness Studies Academy. It's
Oh, I love
taught by
it.
a former Harvard professor, and he shares a bunch of studies. And one of the key factors to happiness are the relationships we have. So it's really important in this time that we try to do something to cultivate those.
Yeah, I love just that, one of the few places that we can go right now is the grocery store. So I really love the idea of saying hello to somebody at the grocery store. And I think so many of us go through the store with our mask on and we're trying not to be close to people. And so it's become this really awkward um, interaction with people. And I love the thought of just, saying hi to somebody versus scurrying past and feeling nervous that you're too close to them.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time to try to, keep these relationships. But yeah, it's so important.
Yeah, I completely agree. Um, so through a number of you have various mediums. You've got blog, you've got your book now, and you're doing many interviews and podcasts. And thank you so much for sharing on my podcast today. And during these throughout these various mediums, you're sharing some very intimate and very personally painful moments. And I want to ask you, how has it felt revealing your story?
It's felt vulnerable. That's a good question, because it has. And when I was going through my cancer journey, for example, I shared a lot because I thought that this is information. I couldn't believe I didn't know very much. So I wanted other women to know what it was like. Uh, but then when I was done, with everything about 2 years in, I decided, okay, I don't want this to be my identity anymore. And so I stopped talking about it entirely. And it wasn't until the interviews for the book came out that it's come up again. And so I realized that there was, uh, and same with the adoption. I don't talk about the adoption issues, and I was surprised actually when it came up. I wasn't expecting it on another interview. It was probably the first time I ever publicly talked about what it's like to be adopted. So it's it made me realize that there's a piece of ego, for lack of better words, that I had been holding on to, that I didn't realize I was holding on to. And so speaking about these things and recognizing that, yeah, these are also stories, and I don't need to hide behind this, and it's okay for me to share. It doesn't take anything away from who I am. Um, it's a process that I had to think about as I started to do these interviews.
Well, I remember when I first met you and you shared your story, and I was so intrigued because our life experiences from infancy, they shape who we are. And being adopted, adopting a child, having breast cancer, that really shapes who you are, how you move within the world, how you react to things, how you see things. And, I think about the things that you've been through and what led you to being able to write this book. Had you not been through some of those journeys, you may not have arrived at the place where you were questioning where you were at in your life. And so this is where, and I think for so many of us, I became a person who I didn't want to be defined by my identity as this woman who had gotten divorced. And like you, I didn't want to share. And I realized that by opening my mouth and saying things that feel very scary, very vulnerable, are really helpful to somebody else who is sitting where I was, or maybe where you were years before. And so I really want to thank you for allowing me the honor to ask you those questions, and for you being so open and sharing those painful personal moments. I think they're going to be so inspirational for somebody who's in your shoes at some point. Uh,
Thank you. Yeah,
and as I
thank
mentioned, you've had quite a journey, and there have been some moments that have really challenged your identity. What's given you strength to rise above each of these challenges that have presented in your life?
right now, honestly, the journaling really helps me. That gives me a lot of strength, and just that time to write has really helped. And it's interesting hearing you talk, because I remember just a few minutes ago saying that when I was diagnosed with cancer, I believed that there was a purpose, and I do. And so sharing, maybe the part of the experiences is because I'm able to share these things, even though they could be very uncomfortable at times. Um, and I think what has given me strength is honestly all of these challenges. Every challenge that has happened. Right now, I say to the universe, can I just learn through reading or podcasts, rather than experiencing them? But in all honesty, what has made me a stronger person is all of my experiences. You mentioned my car accident that was pretty catastrophic, and I ended up in our local trauma one hospital for a period of time. And a janitor had told me that I will be better. And I knew he meant that not just I would physically get better, but I would become a better person. And that stuck with me. And I've thought about it every time something bad has happened. So I think the strength comes really from the struggle.
Mhm. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I went through a period in my life for about a year where it's like I feel like I'd pick myself up and something else, the other shoe would drop. And it got to a point where I said, I feel like I've learned enough this year. Could we just, because I, like you, I took the approach that there's something to learn from this, and I'm going to use this to learn something about myself and to make myself feel stronger. And they do these things. They they have the capacity to show you something more about yourself, show you something that's already inside. That strength and that courage is already there. Sometimes we're not tested to the point that we really need to draw upon it, but I think we discover these things, like things that I've done that I would have never thought possible. And that actually really leads me into my next question, which is, what are the gifts that have come through the journeys that you've been on?
The gifts that have come are, one, as we talked about earlier, recognizing that each day is a gift, and really recognizing this has helped a lot this year with all the chaos and negativity that has happened in our country this year. um, to the gift, to know that this is the way I want to spend my energy and my time. Help keep my my head out of getting caught up in a lot of the ugliness um, that was and is happening. So that's part of the gift. The other gift is I'm able to relate to more people now, and I see people as more than who they are on the outside. And the more I talk to others, like for the book, and speaking to you, I'm recognizing that we all have a common story. there's something that connects us. And I've learned to that if I can focus more on our similarities as opposed to what seems like huge differences, which usually are not, um, that I can appreciate people a lot more.
Mm. Well, and I suspect that, you know, people are opening up to you because you've opened up,
Mhm.
you've been vulnerable, and you've given somebody else the space to feel safe to share more of themselves with you. And the more we share and these deeper connections that we have are so gratifying. And I really feel that we're able to see that we really share so many of the same things at our core.
Yeah, always say now, if Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg could get along despite their fundamental differences, we could all probably find something that we could laugh and joke about.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. And let's hope that happens. Well, Sherry, thank you so much for speaking with me today. It's been such an absolute pleasure. And I really want to thank you for all of the great work that you're doing. And I wanted to ask, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you'd like our listeners to know?
I can't think of anything off of the top of my head, other than to really appreciate the relationships that are around you. And I used to say that people were a blessing or a lesson, and I've changed that to teacher and student because I feel that when we look at someone as a teacher and a student, if we start the relationship off that way, as opposed to looking at someone as a blessing or a lesson, that's kind of looking backwards. A teacher and a student really is looking forward, and you start to see these gifts that people bring to your life, and you see your purpose in their life, and it's such a great groundwork for any relationship.
And Sherry, where can people find you?
Well, the book is on Amazon and my website is, and I didn't talk to a marketing specialist before this, so there's a lot of words here, but it's animperfectlyperfectlife.com.
Fantastic. Well, I'll go ahead and I'll be putting those links in our show notes. And again, Sherry, thank you so much for our conversation today. I've absolutely loved it.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.